I'm sitting in a rental car outside a house in Tulsa, Oklahoma right now, watching a little girl who has my husband's exact laugh climb into his arms on a porch, 300 miles away from the home he shares with me. He doesn't know I'm here yet, but by the end of tonight, he's going to know everything. Before I take you through how I ended up parked outside that house, and trust me, this story gets more unbelievable the further in you go. If you're new to this channel, welcome to Kaynaat Revenge. Every week I share real, raw stories of betrayal and the people who finally stop staying quiet about it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever felt like something in your life didn't add up, no matter how many times someone told you it did. Hit subscribe, because tonight you're going to see exactly what happens when a woman finally trusts her own instincts over someone else's lies. All right, let's go back to where this started. My name is Jasmine Carter. I was 38 years old, living in a quiet suburb outside Dallas, Texas, and for 11 years I thought I had a complicated but fundamentally honest marriage. I met my husband Derek at a mutual friend's barbecue when I was 26. He worked in regional sales for a mid-sized industrial equipment company, which meant travel, a lot of it, sometimes 2 or 3 weeks a month, covering territory across Texas, Oklahoma, and parts of Louisiana and Arkansas. In the beginning, I found the travel almost romantic in a strange way. He'd call every night from a different hotel room, tell me about the towns he was passing through, send me pictures of diners and gas station sunsets. It felt like he was including me in a life that most people would have found lonely. We got married when I was 29. I worked as a pediatric nurse at a hospital in Dallas, steady hours, a job I loved, a career that gave me a strong sense of who I was, independent of my marriage. Derek's travel schedule became just a fact of our life together, the way some couples live with shift work or deployment. I built routines around it. FaceTime calls at 7 every night he was on the road, a shared calendar where he'd note which cities he'd be in, a running joke between us about which gas station chain had the best coffee across 3 states. We had 2 children together, Marcus, who was 9, and Sophie, who was 6. Derek was, by every appearance, a devoted father when he was home. He coached Marcus's baseball team during the summers when his travel eased up. He video-called Sophie every night he was away to hear about her day at school. Our life looked, from the outside and honestly from the inside too, like a full, busy, ordinary kind of happy. There were small things over the years that I noticed and set aside, the way you do when you love someone and you've built a life around trusting them. Derek was occasionally harder to reach on certain nights. He'd blame bad cell service in the middle of nowhere, parts of his territory, which, given how rural some of his routes were, made sense. There was a stretch of about a year where our joint credit card statement showed a recurring charge from a children's clothing store in Tulsa that Derek explained as a gift for my sister's kids. His sister lived in Tulsa, so again, it tracked. When I'd occasionally ask questions that lingered a little too long, Derek had a particular way of responding that I now understand. With hindsight, was a pattern, a slight sigh, a gentle, "Jasmine, you're reading into things that aren't there," and then a subject change to something about the kids, or a compliment about how hard I worked. It always worked. I always let it go. I trusted him, and more than that, I trusted my own life not to contain something so far outside what I thought was possible. That trust held for 11 years. Until a Tuesday afternoon in March, when Sophie's school nurse called me at the hospital where I worked, asking if I could bring in Sophie's updated vaccination records for a school health audit. I went home that evening to pull the folder where we kept both kids' medical paperwork, and while I was searching for it, I found something else entirely. A manila folder, tucked behind our file box, that I had never seen before, labeled in Derek's handwriting with a single word: Tulsa. I want to walk you through exactly what was in that folder, because it took me almost 20 minutes of sitting on our bedroom floor before I could fully process what I was looking at. Inside was a birth certificate for a little girl named Ava, born 5 years earlier in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The father's name listed was Derek's full legal name. The mother's name was a woman I'd never heard of, Michelle Renner. There was also a lease agreement for an apartment, and later, once I dug further, a mortgage document for a small house, both in Tulsa, both listing Derek as a co-signer alongside Michelle. There were photographs. Derek at what looked like a first birthday party, Derek at what looked like a kindergarten graduation, Derek holding a little girl on his shoulders at what I recognized, with a sick lurch in my stomach, as the exact same lake near his sister's house in Tulsa where we'd taken our own kids to visit years before. Derek had another daughter, a daughter he had been actively co-parenting, living a second, parallel domestic life with, for 5 years. Almost half the time we'd been raising Marcus and Sophie together. I didn't confront him that night. I want to be completely honest about why. I was in shock in a way that made me physically unable to trust my own voice. I sat on our bedroom floor until nearly midnight, going through years of memory with new eyes. Every unreachable phone call, every extended trip, every bad service excuse. Every version of the story Derek had told me about his territory and his schedule. It all rearranged itself into a shape I could barely stand to look at. Over the following weeks, working carefully and quietly, I pieced together the full picture. Derek had met Michelle roughly 6 years into our marriage, on one of his regular Tulsa routes. What began, as far as I could tell from later conversations and documents, as an affair had become something else entirely once Michelle became pregnant. Derek had chosen not to end it, and not to tell me, but instead to build a second household around it, using the built-in cover of a travel-heavy job to split his life almost evenly between two families who had no idea the other existed. The financial picture was its own kind of devastating. Derek had been using a portion of our joint income, money I believed was covering business travel expenses, hotel costs, and territory-related spending, to help support Michelle and Ava's household. The children's clothing store charges I'd noticed years earlier weren't gifts for his sister's kids. They were for his other daughter. When I pulled bank statements going back years, working with the kind of careful, clinical focus I usually reserved for reviewing patient charts at the hospital, I found a consistent pattern. Roughly $800 to $1,200 a month, over 5 years, quietly diverted toward an entirely separate life, funded in part by money that should have gone toward our own children's college savings. But the part that broke something fundamental in me wasn't the money, and honestly, by that point, it wasn't even fully the existence of Ava herself, though God knows that was its own grief I had to sit with. A little girl who existed because of a lie, who I felt, in some complicated way I couldn't fully untangle, no anger toward at all. The part that broke something was realizing the scale of the gaslighting. Every single time some instinct in me had flickered, a strange phone call pattern, an unexplained charge, a slightly too smooth explanation, Derek had met that instinct with calm, practiced reassurance designed to make me distrust myself instead of him. He had spent 5 years teaching me, one small conversation at a time, not to trust my own perception of my own life. And it had worked, because I loved him, and because the alternative, that the person I'd built a family with was capable of something like this, was simply too enormous to hold on to without proof. I finally had proof. Sitting on that floor with Ava's birth certificate in my hands, I understood that the proof didn't just confirm an affair. It confirmed that for 5 years, my own judgment about my own marriage had been quietly, deliberately dismantled by someone I trusted completely. I didn't tell Derek what I'd found for almost 3 weeks. During that time, I went to work at the hospital, cared for Marcus and Sophie, made dinner, answered Derek's nightly FaceTime calls with a steadiness that, even now, I don't fully know how I sustained. Some part of me needed that time, not to plan revenge yet, not at first, but simply to survive the shock without shattering in front of my children. The breaking point came on an ordinary Thursday evening. Derek was home for a few days between routes, and we were in the kitchen after the kids had gone to bed. He was telling me, easily, casually, about an upcoming trip, probably 4 or 5 days, heading up through Oklahoma, same territory as always, and I watched him say the word Oklahoma with the exact same relaxed, unbothered tone he'd used 100 times before, knowing now what that word actually meant, knowing he was describing a trip to see another family while looking directly into my eyes. Something in me went very still in that moment, the way water goes still right before it turns to ice. I remember setting down the dish towel I was holding, very deliberately, and asking him, in a voice that surprised me with how calm it sounded, "How's Ava doing? Is she liking kindergarten?" I have never, in 11 years of marriage, watched a person's face change the way Derek's changed in that moment. The color left him almost instantly. For several seconds, he didn't say anything at all, just stood there, mouth slightly open, as 15 years of a story he'd told himself about being untouchable collapsed in real time in our kitchen. He tried, briefly, to deny it, to ask what I was talking about, and I understood in that instant that even now, even caught, his first instinct was to reach for the same tool he'd used on me for 5 years, to make me doubt what I knew. I told him I'd seen the birth certificate. I told him I'd seen the lease, the photos, the bank statements. I watched the denial collapse into something closer to panic, and then into a kind of pleading I found almost unbearable to witness. "Jasmine, please, let me explain. It's not what you think. I never stopped loving you and the kids. I didn't let him finish. I told him I needed him to leave the house that night, to stay somewhere else, and that I would tell him when I was ready to talk again." He left, and once his car pulled out of the driveway, I sat down at our kitchen table, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I let myself cry. Not out of weakness, but because I finally understood that the marriage I thought I had simply hadn't existed for a very long time. Somewhere underneath that grief, though, something else was already forming. A clear, cold resolve that I was not going to let this situation be managed by Derek's version of events. Not this time. Not ever again. Over the following 2 months, I built what I needed methodically, the same way I'd approach any serious problem at the hospital. Gather every piece of information, understand the full scope, then act with precision rather than emotion. I hired a family law attorney named Rebecca Sloan, recommended by a colleague at the hospital who had gone through her own difficult divorce years earlier. Rebecca was direct with me from our first meeting, given the extended affair, the years of financial diversion, and, critically, the existence of a legal document, the birth certificate, establishing Derek's paternity of a child outside our marriage. I had strong grounds not just for divorce, but for a financial settlement that accounted for the marital assets that had been quietly redirected over 5 years. I also hired a forensic accountant, a methodical man named Aaron Kessler, who spent 6 weeks reconstructing the full financial picture. His final report was almost 70 pages, documenting a consistent, traceable pattern of joint funds diverted toward a second household. Money that, under Texas community property law, I was legally entitled to have factored into our marital settlement. At the same time, I quietly began securing my own independent financial footing, something I realized I'd never fully built because I'd always trusted we finances over mine. I opened an individual account. I consulted with a financial advisor about my long-term stability as a single parent to Marcus and Sophie. I spoke, carefully and without alarming them, to my own parents about the possibility of temporary support if I needed it during the transition, though ultimately, I never needed to ask. The hardest part of this preparation wasn't the financial or legal work. It was deciding what to do about Ava. I want to be honest with you about this, because it's the part of this story people ask me about the most. I made a decision early on that whatever consequences Derek faced, I was not going to let a 5-year-old child bear the weight of her father's choices. Through Rebecca, I made clear that I had no interest in exposing or shaming Ava or her mother, Michelle, who I came to understand, through documents that later surfaced in the legal process, had herself been misled by Derek in specific, calculated ways about the true state of his marriage to me, including at one point being shown a forged, informal separation agreement that Derek had fabricated to convince her our marriage was already effectively over. Michelle, it turned out, was not simply a willing participant in deceiving me. In her own way, she had been deceived too. That reframing didn't erase my anger at Derek. If anything, it sharpened it, because it meant he hadn't just lied to one family. He'd built an entire architecture of lies designed to keep two households functioning in parallel ignorance of each other, manipulating both of us in different, tailored ways to keep the structure standing. What I did decide to expose, deliberately and without hesitation, was Derek's misuse of company resources. Rebecca and Aaron's forensic report showed that a portion of the diverted funds had been processed through expense reports Derek submitted to his employer, falsely categorized business travel and lodging costs that were, in reality, covering rent and living expenses for his second household. That wasn't just a betrayal of me, it was corporate expense fraud, and I made the decision that his employer deserved to know the truth, separate from and in addition to our divorce proceedings. I told almost no one during this period, aside from my attorney, my accountant, and my own parents. I kept working my regular shifts at the hospital. I kept Marcus and Sophie's routines as stable and normal as I possibly could, even as I was quietly building the legal and financial foundation for the rest of our lives, without Derek in the house. When people ask me how I managed to stay so composed during those 2 months, the honest answer is that composure was the only thing I had left that Derek hadn't already tried to take from me, and I was not going to give it up voluntarily. I filed for divorce on a Monday morning in May, citing adultery and requesting a disproportionate share of marital assets based on the documented financial diversion, supported by Aaron's full forensic report as an exhibit. Rebecca had prepared everything meticulously. There was no ambiguity for Derek's attorney to work with once the documentation was laid out. That same week, separately from the divorce filing, I submitted a detailed report to Derek's employer's Internal Ethics and Compliance Department, including copies of the expense reports alongside Aaron's forensic analysis showing which charges corresponded to Michelle and Ava's household expenses rather than legitimate business costs. I want to be clear that this wasn't an impulsive act of anger. I thought about it for weeks, discussed it thoroughly with Rebecca to understand any implications for our own proceedings, and ultimately decided that a company should not be unknowingly subsidizing an employee's concealment of a second family through fraudulent expense claims. 2 weeks after I submitted that report, Derek was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. 3 months later, he was terminated for cause, which, under the terms of his compensation structure, also meant forfeiting a substantial unvested bonus and stock package he'd been counting on, money that, under different circumstances, would have factored into our divorce settlement negotiations. The divorce proceedings themselves took nearly 7 months. Derek's attorney initially pushed back hard on the disproportionate asset division, but once Aaron's forensic report was formally entered as evidence, showing, in granular detail, 5 years of diverted joint funds, that argument became almost impossible to sustain credibly in front of a judge. We ultimately settled. I retained the family home, the majority of our retirement and investment accounts, to offset the diverted funds, and primary physical custody of Marcus and Sophie, with a structured, supervised transition period for Derek's visitation, given the significant disruption to the children's understanding of their family. Telling Marcus and Sophie was, without question, the hardest part of this entire process. Harder than any legal filing or confrontation. I worked with a family therapist who specialized in situations involving parental infidelity and half-siblings, and we age-appropriately explained that their father had made serious mistakes that meant he wouldn't be living with us anymore. Without placing blame on Ava, who, I made a deliberate choice to explain gently, was their half-sister, someone who existed through no fault of her own, and who they might, someday, if everyone chose it, have a relationship with. That's a decision I still stand by. Derek's failures were his own. I was not going to let them define how my children understood their own family, present or future. I never met Michelle directly, though I understand, through mutual awareness during the legal proceedings, that she eventually pursued her own legal action against Derek once the fabricated separation agreement came to light. Action I neither encouraged nor discouraged, because that reckoning, ultimately, wasn't mine to manage. What I focused on, entirely, was rebuilding a stable, honest life for myself and for Marcus and Sophie, on our own terms, without a single additional lie holding any part of it together. I'm not going to pretend this story ends with some neat, uncomplicated bow on it, because 11 years of marriage and a discovery like this don't resolve that simply. But I will tell you, honestly, that I feel something close to full satisfaction when I think about how I handled every single part of this. And that surprises even me, given how devastating the discovery itself was. I think the satisfaction comes from this. At every decision point, I chose precision over impulse, and truth over convenient silence. I didn't destroy Ava's understanding of her father out of anger, even though I had every right to feel angry. I didn't let Derek's employer keep unknowingly funding his second life. I didn't accept a settlement that ignored 5 years of documented financial harm just to make the process end faster. Every choice I made deliberately, with a clear head, even while carrying grief that some days felt genuinely unbearable. Marcus and Sophie are doing well now, nearly 2 years out from the divorce. Marcus still plays baseball, though I coach alongside another parent now instead of Derek. Sophie asked me, about a year ago, if she could someday meet Ava, and I told her that decision would always be hers to make when she's old enough to make it fully on her own terms. Not mine, and not Derek's. I went back to school part-time last year and completed a nurse practitioner program I'd put off for almost a decade, partly because Derek's unpredictable travel schedule had always made the timing feel impossible. It's a strange, quiet kind of victory, sitting in those night classes, realizing that some of the life I'm finally building for myself only became possible once the version of my marriage I thought I had stopped absorbing all the space where my own ambitions used to live. I think about that folder labeled Tulsa sometimes, still sitting somewhere in a box of documents from the divorce proceedings. I used to think finding it was the worst moment of my life. Now I understand it as the moment I finally started trusting myself again. And honestly, that trust, once I got it back, turned out to be worth more than anything Derek ever took from me. If you've ever had an instinct about someone you loved, and let yourself be talked out of trusting it, I hope this story reminds you that your judgment deserves better than that. You deserve better than that. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Kaynaat Revenge. Next week, I'll be back with another true-to-life story of betrayal and the strength it takes to finally stop staying quiet.